Matthew Evans, a wealthy man in his late 70s, sat alone in his silver Mercedes, tapping his thumb impatiently against the steering wheel. The Kentucky heat pressed against the windows, with the air conditioner barely keeping it at bay. Retired from a successful career in finance, Matthew was accustomed to life bending to his will. His world was one of polished floors, expensive suits, and effortless convenience. But that day, fate had other plans. Stranded with a flat tire on a lonely stretch of road, far from the comforts of his pristine mansion, he found himself unusually powerless. After several failed attempts to call for roadside assistance due to a lack of signal, Matthew sighed, resigning himself to wait. Frustration bubbled beneath his composed exterior. Just as impatience was beginning to settle in, he noticed a figure walking toward him. A boy, no older than 13 or 14, approached with quiet confidence. His faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers suggested a life far removed from wealth, yet there was something assured in his steps. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady. "Yes," Matthew replied, feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. "I was hoping for some help, but my phone has no signal." The boy smiled slightly. "I can help," he said, kneeling beside the car without hesitation. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer. Do you have a spare?" Matthew nodded toward the trunk, watching as the boy pulled out the necessary tools. The young stranger worked swiftly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Matthew, used to measuring people by their financial status, felt something unexpected: humility. As he stood there, watching this boy help him without expectation of reward, something in him shifted. As Matthew watched the boy work with quiet confidence, he felt an unusual sense of humility wash over him. He had spent his life surrounded by people who expected something in return for their efforts: business partners, investors, employees. Yet here was a young boy, dressed in worn-out sneakers and a faded t-shirt, offering his help without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. Within minutes, the tire was changed, and the boy wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping back with a small, satisfied smile. "All done," he said simply. Matthew reached into his wallet, pulling out a few crisp bills. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help," he said, extending the money toward the boy. But the boy took a step back, shaking his head politely. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. Just happy to help." For a moment, Matthew stood there, stunned, the money still in his hand. He had encountered thousands of people in his lifetime, but very few had ever refused payment for their time. He watched as the boy turned and walked away down the road, his posture relaxed, his stride steady. There was something about the way he carried himself, self-assured, dignified, unburdened by material expectations, that lingered in Matthew's mind long after the boy had disappeared from sight. Getting back into his car, Matthew continued his drive, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy. There was an integrity about him, a quiet strength that seemed rare in today's world. That night, as Matthew sat in the leather armchair of his grand study, surrounded by expensive furnishings and shelves of books he rarely opened, he found himself staring at his untouched dinner, a perfectly prepared steak and asparagus. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the boy's actions, his simple but profound kindness. Matthew had spent his entire life chasing wealth, success, and influence, believing that money was the measure of a person's worth. Yet here was a boy who had so little, yet seemed richer in ways Matthew could not quite define. The contrast unsettled him. He had given the boy an opportunity to take money, an easy reward for a simple favor, yet the boy had chosen to walk away with nothing but a smile. Unable to shake the feeling that something was left unfinished, Matthew made a decision. He needed to find the boy again, to understand the kind of person who could turn down wealth so effortlessly. The next morning, He got in his car and set out to search for him. The next morning, Matthew woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't shake the memory of the boy, his quiet confidence, his selflessness, his refusal to accept money. It was a stark contrast to the world Matthew knew, where every favor came with a price. He needed to find the boy again, not just to thank him, but to understand what made him different. Matthew drove back to the same stretch of road where they had met, scanning the area for any sign of the boy. He stopped at gas stations and small diners along the way, asking anyone who would listen if they had seen a young boy matching his description. Most people shrugged or shook their heads, offering little help. Just as he began to feel discouraged, he stopped at a small roadside cafe, where an older woman behind the counter listened attentively as he described the boy. "Sounds like you're talking about Elijah," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "That boy's always helping folks around here. Lives with his mama over in Harlan." "Harlan," Matthew repeated, making a mental note. "Thank you." The town of Harlan was about an hour's drive away, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians. The drive was scenic, but Matthew barely noticed. His mind was racing with questions. What kind of life did this boy have? What kind of family raised someone with such integrity? He had met thousands of people in his lifetime, people who had built fortunes, powerful men who dictated the economy. But none of them had left an impression on him the way Elijah had. When he finally arrived in Harlan, he found a quiet town lined with modest homes and small businesses. He asked a few locals about Elijah, and eventually, someone pointed him toward a small house on the outskirts of town. Pulling up in front, Matthew hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he would even say. Why had he come all this way? What was he hoping to accomplish? Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car and knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s. She looked tired but kind, her eyes sharp and curious as she sized him up. "Can I help you?" she asked. Matthew cleared his throat. "Good morning. I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday, Elijah. He helped me with a flat tire." Her expression softened instantly, a small smile forming on her lips. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said warmly. "He's always helping folks." Matthew stood at the doorway, feeling slightly out of place in his tailored suit against the backdrop of the modest home. The woman, Elijah's mother, regarded him with warmth, but also a hint of curiosity. "I just wanted to thank him properly," Matthew said, shifting his weight slightly. "Yesterday he wouldn't accept anything from me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." She nodded knowingly. "That's Elijah for you. He never expects anything in return." Stepping aside, she gestured for him to come in. "He's out back fixing the fence. You're welcome to wait." Matthew hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The house was small but well kept, filled with signs of a loving home. Family photos lined the walls, and drawings, likely from a much younger Elijah, were proudly displayed on the fridge. The furniture was worn but arranged with care, and the scent of something warm and comforting lingered in the air. Compared to his own immaculate mansion, where everything was pristine but lifeless, this space felt full of warmth and character. Following Elijah's mother through the house, they stepped out into the backyard, where the boy was hard at work repairing a section of the fence. His sleeves were rolled up and his hands were covered in dirt, but there was a focus in his movements that made Matthew pause. This was a child who didn't just help strangers. He worked hard for his own family too. Elijah looked up, surprised to see Matthew standing there. "Hey, mister," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled, feeling an odd sense of nervousness. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, his expression easy and genuine. It wasn't a big deal. "To me it was," Matthew said firmly. He studied the boy for a moment before adding, People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return. Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if puzzled by the statement. I don't see it like that, he said simply. If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I? Matthew was struck by the simplicity of the boy's logic. It was such a pure way of looking at the world, so different from the calculated exchanges he was used to in business. He glanced around the yard, the patched-up fence, the uneven grass, the worn swing set. It was clear that Elijah's family didn't have much, yet they carried themselves with dignity and resilience. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Matthew said sincerely. Your mother must be proud. Elijah grinned, glancing toward the house. She works hard. I just try to help out where I can. Matthew was quiet for a moment, absorbing the boy's words. He thought of his own childhood, one spent in a house not unlike this one. His parents had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, teaching him the value of hard work and perseverance. Over the years, he had drifted away from those lessons, caught up in the relentless pursuit of wealth and status. Looking at Elijah now, he felt something stir within him, an odd mix of nostalgia, admiration, and regret. He had come here out of curiosity, but now he felt a deeper pull. He wanted to do something for this family, not out of pity, but because it felt right. I'd like to do something for you and your family, Matthew said at last. Elijah straightened, his expression cautious. We're okay, mister. We don't need anything. It's not about need, Matthew insisted. It's about what's right. You helped me, and I'd like to return the favor. Before Elijah could respond, his mother stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Elijah, you better come inside and wash up before lunch, she called. Then, turning to Matthew, she added, Would you care to join us? It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome. Matthew hesitated, unaccustomed to such a simple, heartfelt invitation. But the sincerity in her voice left him no room for excuses. I'd like that, he said. As Matthew stepped inside Elijah's home, he felt an unfamiliar sense of warmth settle over him. The kitchen was small but inviting, filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables. A modest wooden table stood in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs, but it was set with care. It was a stark contrast to the grandeur of his own dining room, where a long, polished table often sat untouched, accompanied only by silence. Elijah washed his hands at the sink and took his seat beside his mother, who served generous portions of the meal with practiced ease. I hope you don't mind simple food, she said with a smile. Matthew shook his head. Not at all. As he took his first bite, he realized how long it had been since he had truly savored a home-cooked meal. He listened as Elijah talked about his school, his friends, and his dreams of becoming an engineer. His mother spoke with quiet pride about their close-knit community and the way people looked out for one another. For the first time in years, Matthew felt like more than just a wealthy businessman. He felt present, engaged, connected. He had spent decades accumulating wealth, yet sitting at this humble table, surrounded by laughter and genuine conversation, he realized that happiness wasn't found in expensive possessions, but in moments like these. As the meal came to an end, Elijah helped clear the table, his movements quick and practiced. It was evident that he was used to helping around the house, taking responsibility without complaint. Matthew watched him, still in awe of the boy's character. You've done a remarkable job raising him, he said to Elijah's mother. He has more heart than most people I know. She smiled, though her eyes held a trace of weariness. Thank you. He's a good boy. But we've had our struggles. We've learned to appreciate the small things. Matthew nodded, his mind already turning over ideas. He didn't want to overstep, but he also couldn't walk away without doing something for them. This family had given him something he hadn't even realized he needed, a reminder of what truly mattered. As he stood to leave, he turned to Elijah. I meant what I said earlier. I want to do something for you and your family. Elijah hesitated. Mister, we really don't need... I know, Matthew interrupted gently. But that's not the point. You helped me, and I want to return the favor. Not because you need it, but because you deserve it. Elijah's mother studied Matthew for a moment before offering a small nod. If that's truly what you want, then thank you. Matthew smiled, knowing this was just the beginning. The decision had been made. Matthew left Elijah's home that afternoon with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about charity, it was about honoring the boy's kindness and resilience. Elijah and his mother had shown him something rare, something money couldn't buy: selflessness, integrity, and the true meaning of giving. The next morning, Matthew made phone calls, lots of them. He reached out to old colleagues, contractors, and suppliers. By midday, a plan was in motion. Within a week, trucks and workers began arriving at Elijah's home, carrying supplies to repair and renovate the house. Matthew stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, directing the workers, as Elijah and his mother watched in shock. You didn't have to do this, Elijah's mother said, her voice trembling as she saw the crew unloading wood, paint, and roofing materials. Matthew turned to her with a calm but determined expression. You've done more than just manage. You've thrived. But you gave me something I didn't even realize I was missing. Let me give back. Elijah stood next to his mother, unusually quiet, his gaze shifting between Matthew and the construction crew. When Matthew knelt slightly to meet his eyes, he spoke gently. You taught me something, Elijah. Helping people isn't about money. It's about showing up. I want to show up for you. Over the next several weeks, the house underwent a complete transformation. The sagging porch was replaced with sturdy wood, the roof was repaired, and the rusty swing set in the backyard was replaced with a new one. Inside, the walls were painted, the floors polished, and the kitchen upgraded with modern appliances. At first, Elijah insisted on helping, carrying planks and sweeping debris, but Matthew gently urged him to take a break. Your job, Matthew said with a smile, is to enjoy being a kid for a little while. Still, Elijah couldn't resist watching the renovations closely. One of the workers, a burly man named Joe, noticed his curiosity and invited him to help measure and cut wood. Soon, Elijah was asking questions about construction, fascinated by the process. Matthew observed from a distance, feeling a growing pride in the boy. For the first time in years, Matthew felt he was doing something truly meaningful. This was more than just fixing a house. It was restoring a sense of stability, security, and hope for a family who had given him more than they would ever realize. As the final days of the renovation approached, the house was nearly unrecognizable. The once worn exterior now gleamed with fresh paint. The porch stood sturdy and inviting, and the backyard, which had once been marked by broken swings and uneven ground, now featured a new playset and a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, the home had been given new life: polished floors, freshly painted walls, and a kitchen filled with modern appliances. On the last day of construction, the atmosphere felt almost celebratory. Neighbors stopped by to see the transformation, some bringing small gifts, freshly baked bread, jars of homemade jam, even a potted plant. Children ran through the yard, their laughter filling the air, and Elijah's wide-eyed excitement was unmistakable as he showed his friends around his newly renovated home. Elijah's mother stood on the porch, looking around in awe, her hands covering her mouth as she fought back tears. She turned to Matthew, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just a house anymore," she whispered. "It's a home. I don't know how we can ever thank you." Matthew shook his head, his voice soft. "You already have," he replied. "You and Elijah reminded me of something I had forgotten, what life is truly about: family, connection, purpose." Elijah, who had been quietly watching, finally spoke. "Mr. Matthew," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us. I want to do something like this one day. I want to help people too." Matthew smiled, placing a firm but gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already are, Elijah. Your kindness set all of this in motion. Never lose that." The three of them stood on the porch, watching the golden sunset stretch across the sky, the warmth of the day lingering not just in the air but in their hearts. As Matthew prepared to leave, Elijah and his mother walked him to his car. The boy's wide grin and his mother's tearful smile would stay with him long after he drove away. But as he turned onto the road, he realized something. This wasn't the end. The weeks that followed only strengthened their bond. Elijah's curiosity about construction blossomed into a passion, and Matthew arranged for him to spend time learning from the workers who had helped renovate the house. With each visit to Harlan, Matthew felt less like an outsider and more like family. For the first time in years, he was content, not because of wealth or success, but because he had found something far more valuable: purpose. As we journey through life, we often measure success by wealth, possessions, and status. But true fulfillment comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we give. Matthew Evans, a man who spent decades building his fortune, discovered that kindness, connection, and purpose held far greater value than any material wealth. His encounter with Elijah, a young boy with little to his name but a heart full of generosity, reminded him that the most meaningful acts in life are often the simplest ones. For those in their later years, this story serves as a powerful reflection. As time passes, we begin to realize that the legacy we leave behind is not about money, but about the impact we have on others. A small act of kindness, a shared moment, or a helping hand can change a life. It is never too late to reconnect, to give without expectation, and to rediscover what truly matters. The greatest wealth is not found in bank accounts, but in the relationships we nurture and the kindness we spread. In the end, a life filled with generosity and love is a life well lived.